The first thing she noticed was the dust. It clung to her hem and lashes, filled her mouth and nostrils, coated her sweat-slick skin like a second, cruder hide. The wedding dress, once white, was now the color of old parchment, torn at the knees, stained at the hips, and heavy with the weight of her escape. Her boots were not hers. She had stolen them from the stable boy's bunk after slipping out through the kitchen door before dawn. They were 2 sizes too large and rubbed her raw, but they carried her westward, farther than she ever imagined she could walk. By the time she saw the curve of smoke above the butte, her legs were barely moving. The sky had taken on that flat, silver hue of mid-morning heat, where the horizon shimmered and wavered like something imagined. Her lips cracked when she tried to speak. Her tongue felt swollen and dry, and the world tipped sideways in brief, jolting spells. She staggered over the last ridge, then crumpled into the dust like a marionette whose strings had been severed. Her body hit the ground with a soft thud, dress fanning around her like a broken lily. She lay still. From the edge of the camp, someone watched. The elder moved slowly. He did not rush nor call out, but walked with the deliberation of one who had seen many things and knew the difference between true danger and a soul in distress. He wore a woven headband to keep back his silver hair, and his weathered hands were steady as stone. Children paused their play. Women glanced up from baskets and looms. No one followed. This was not theirs to intervene in. He crouched beside the collapsed woman, casting a long shadow over her motionless form. One knobby hand reached out, touched her brow, then lifted her wrist. She was breathing, not well, but alive. He took the water skin from his belt and held it to her lips. It was not a gift, it was an offering. She drank, reflexively at first, then greedily. Water ran down her chin and neck, soaking the lace and sweat and grit. When she coughed, he did not flinch. When she opened her eyes, blue, bloodshot, ringed in shadow, he met them without question. "You ran far," he said. She tried to nod but couldn't manage it. "You can rest here." "For a little while." Her mouth moved around words that wouldn't come. He studied her, not with curiosity, but with knowing. "There is always a reason," he said, "but reasons are not the same as choices. You still have one of those." He did not ask where she had come from, not yet. The desert would tell him in its own time. Stories had a way of rising with the wind. He rose and offered a hand. She hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the sand, to the worn boots and broken dress, to the dirt beneath her fingernails. Then slowly she placed her palm in his. It was not a promise, but it was enough. The camp was quiet, not in the way that signaled fear or avoidance, but with the natural hush of a people long acquainted with the land's rhythm. Chickens clucked from behind low woven fences. Smoke curled from cooking fires. A boy shaped clay with his thumbs, while his sister braided stalks of grass into loops. No one stared, not openly, but she felt their eyes like a whisper against her skin. The elder led her to a small hogan set apart from the others, shaded by a crooked juniper tree whose bark curled like old paper. It wasn't exile. It was courtesy, a place to settle her breath without the press of too many questions. Inside, the air was cool. Clay walls held the heat at bay. A woven rug covered the floor, worn in the center where feet had passed for years. A bundle of corn husks rested near the fire pit, and herbs hung in bunches from the rafters: sage, chamomile, bitter root. The elder motioned to a folded blanket. "Rest." She did, curled into herself like a leaf against frost. She slept through the heat of the day, and when she woke, the light had shifted, softer, angled low, the color of apricots and blood. He was still there. She flinched at first, but he made no move toward her. "I am Hashkay," he said simply. "You don't have to speak yet." Her voice was hoarse when it came. "Marla." He nodded, as though the name told him something he already suspected. "Your face is not burned by this sun. Your feet are not used to this land." "I didn't plan it," she whispered. Hashkay didn't reply, only stirred the small fire and set a tin of herbs into the embers. The scent filled the space, earthy, sharp, grounding. She watched the flames flicker in his dark eyes. "My sister will bring food," he said after a moment. "You should eat before night." Marla hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. "Will she mind?" Hashkay smiled, a faint tug at the corner of his mouth. "She'll be glad for the company. She's never had a bride for dinner." She winced. I mean I did." He held up a hand. You are what you are, not what they dressed you as. And that more than any kindness undid her. Her throat thickened. She turned away, swallowing hard. When the woman arrived, her name was Sanny. Her hair was coiled tight and streaked with gray. She brought blue corn mush and mutton stew, a hard crust of fry bread wrapped in cloth. She did not ask questions, only looked once, long and level, and gave a nod of understanding that held no pity. Marla ate slowly, hand trembling around the spoon. Hunger burned behind her ribs like a cold stove relit. After, they left her alone again. She sat beneath the crooked juniper, watching stars gather between branches. The wind lifted her hair. Somewhere nearby, a flute was playing, a slow tune, lonely and soft, like a story being told without words. She thought of the chapel, of the veil yanked from her face as she turned and fled, of the gasping crowd and the silence that followed her running feet, of her mother's voice, distant and shrill, and the groom's hand reaching but not fast enough, and then the open sky, the road. The wind at her back and the terrible, beautiful clarity of forward motion. Her fingers traced the stitching on her borrowed boots. Blisters had burst and bled, but the skin would harden. Behind her, a voice spoke low. "You are not hunted," Hashke said. "Not yet, but the world finds those who try to disappear." Marla looked up. He sat on the threshold, whittling a piece of wood. His hands were steady. His eyes steady, too. She nodded. "Then I'll go farther." "There's farther, yes, but also deeper, and sometimes still." She didn't answer. The wind carried dust and the scent of juniper. The stars blinked like watchful eyes. "What choice were you speaking of?" she asked finally. He set the carving down. "The one that matters more than the one you already made, to keep running or to root." She frowned. "I don't know how." "You don't have to yet." He rose, his silhouette lean and patient in the doorway. "But when you're ready, the land listens." She stayed outside long after he left, hands clasped around her knees, her heart slowly easing from its gallop to a quieter rhythm. Behind her, the hogan pulsed with firelight. Before her, the desert breathed. She didn't know yet where she belonged, but she was no longer falling. Morning came without ceremony. No bells, no doors creaking on polished hinges. Only the hush of wind across sand and the low murmur of waking birds. Marla stirred beneath the blanket, crusted with sleep, her hair a tangle against the woven mat. For a moment, she didn't move. She lay still, listening to the slow beat of the world around her. Then she stood. Her legs were sore but stronger. The blisters on her feet had begun to scab. She washed her face at the basin beside the door, rainwater, cool and bracing, then stepped into the light, unsure whether she was guest or intruder. The camp was alive again, a different kind of quiet, purposeful. Smoke drifted from the fire pits where women turned fry bread and stirred pots. A group of men shaped bows under the lean-to, smoothing sinew with care. Children ran past her with shouts in a language she didn't know, trailing dust and laughter. No one stopped her, but they watched, as they had before, not with suspicion, but the way one might regard a hawk pausing among sparrows. Sanny waved her over. Her hands were red with dye, busy with strands of wool stretched between wooden posts. "You sleep long," the older woman said, not unkindly. "I didn't mean to," Marla murmured. Sanny shrugged. "Your bones needed it." She handed Marla a strip of dried meat. Marla took it, chewing slowly. Sanny's eyes flicked to her boots. "You didn't walk all this way for nothing." "I didn't have a plan." "No one who runs ever does." That truth settled between them. Sanny didn't ask for more. Later, Hashke called her to walk. They climbed the red slope behind the camp, where the wind cut harder and the stones grew sharper. He moved steadily, not speaking, letting the silence stretch long between them. Marla followed, breath short, heart louder in her chest than his footsteps on the gravel. They stopped at a bluff overlooking the canyon. Below, the land folded into itself in waves of ochre and bone. Thin veins of water threaded through the rock, shining like silver scars. Hashke knelt and traced a line in the dust with his finger. "This land," he said, "remembers every storm, every hoofprint, every prayer whispered to the stones. It holds what people leave behind." She crouched beside him, unsure if she was meant to respond. "What will you leave, Marla?" Her mouth went dry. "I'm not staying." I didn't ask that. I don't have anything to give, she said and meant it. Her hands, soft and trembling, were not shaped for offering. Even the broken feed the earth, Hashke said. A cracked pot still carries water if you drink before it spills. She stared at the canyon. The heat shimmered against her skin. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then she whispered, I was supposed to be someone else, a wife, a lady. I wasn't brave enough to say no until the door was already open. Bravery doesn't start big, he said. Sometimes it begins with walking. They returned slowly. When they reached the edge of camp, a small girl with twin braids stood waiting. She offered Marla a bundle, fabric and thread. No words, just the shape of an invitation. That evening, Marla sat beside Sani and the other women. She listened more than she spoke, fingers clumsy with the needle but steadying bit by bit. The thread pulled tight, colors weaving through canvas like veins through skin. Later still, she watched the fire flicker beneath the stars. The same flute played, a little closer now. The tune no longer felt foreign. She thought of her mother's cold hands tightening laces too tight, of the altar, tall as judgment, of a man she barely knew waiting to bind her with a name that wasn't hers. She touched the stitch she'd made, crooked, small, and let her fingers rest on the fabric. Her own mark, just one, but it stayed. The days took shape quietly. Time in the camp moved without the sharp edges she had known. No clocks, no appointments, no corsets laced too tight. Only sun and wind and the smell of earth, only tasks that began when they were needed and ended when the work was done. Marla mended clothes, clumsy at first, then less so. She helped gather firewood with the younger women, learned to tell which branches would burn hot and which ones would smoke too much. She learned to dry corn, grind it between stones until her arms ached. Her palms toughened. Her shoulders darkened beneath the sun. Still no one asked why she had come. One morning, a boy led her to the edge of the camp and pointed west. A lamb had gone missing. Marla understood the gesture more than the words. She tied a wet cloth around her neck and walked in the direction he'd shown her. She found the lamb an hour later, tangled in scrub, bleeding from a shallow cut across its flank. It cried out when she approached, a thin, panicked sound. Her dress caught on thorns as she knelt beside it. I know, she whispered. I know you didn't mean to run this far. She spoke to it gently, slowly untangling the coarse weeds from its legs. When she lifted it, it did not resist. Blood trickled down her forearm, warm and oddly steadying. The way its heartbeat thudded against her ribs reminded her she still had one of her own. When she returned, the boy took the lamb with a solemn nod, then handed her a length of clean cloth for her arm. She began to understand then that gratitude here was not spoken. It was offered back in labor, in shared food, in presence. Later that week, the sky changed. A storm moved in from the south, sudden and wide, its belly low and gray. The wind came first, cold and fast, stirring dust into the cookfires. Children were called inside. Blankets weighted the roof poles. Marla helped Hashke secure the bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. He worked with calm precision, like he'd weathered this kind of storm 1,000 times. You've seen many rains, she said. Every storm teaches something new, he replied. The rain fell hard. It beat against the clay walls, drummed on the roof, ran in rivulets past the door. Inside, Marla sat near the hearth and watched shadows shift in the firelight. She expected fear to rise in her, as it always had before, when thunder cracked, when walls shook. But here, she felt no panic, only the steadiness of a place made to endure. That night, Hashke carved again, the small blade flicking curls from wood. Storms change things, he said, eyes on the figure emerging in his hands. They wash the old, soften the hard. Some roots grow deeper after the rain. She nodded, drawn to the shape taking form, a woman small and strong-backed, holding a basin. For offerings, she asked. For choice, he answered. The storm passed by dawn. The sky cleared, washed clean. Marla stepped into the wet earth, her boots sinking slightly, and tilted her face to the rising sun. The air smelled of sage and renewal. She had not made a decision, not yet. But something inside her had shifted, like dry soil loosening beneath water. A space opening, a possibility taking root. It was during the third moon that the stranger arrived. His horse came limping into the valley, dust caked into its coat, and the man astride it wore the weariness of one who'd ridden long without sleep. His hat was pulled low, jaw shadowed with stubble, boots worn down to the welt. He dismounted stiffly and raised both hands in greeting, open, unthreatening. Hashke met him at the edge of the camp. There were no drawn rifles, no shouted warnings, just the wind shifting in the mesquite and the sound of hooves settling into stillness. The man asked for water. He drank it slow, each swallow deliberate. Then he asked if a white woman had come this way. Blonde, blue-eyed, wearing a dress not fit for the desert. Marla stood in the doorway of the weaving shelter, hands stilled over the thread. Her heart began to race, not with panic, but with the deep, electric sense that something long buried had begun to stir. Hashke didn't turn to look at her. He only said, "Many come, not all stay." The man nodded, eyes scanning the camp, landing on each woman for a beat too long. He said his name was Evan, that he'd come from Santa Rosa, that he was looking for someone who'd made a mistake. Marla stepped back into the shadows, her breath shallowed but her hands did not tremble. Sanny came to her then, a cloth bundle in her arms. "You can stay inside," she said. "I don't want to hide." Sanny tilted her head. "Then don't. But decide for yourself, not for him." That night Marla did not sleep. She watched the fire burn low, thought of the path she'd carved through dry riverbeds and rocky hills. Thought of the lamb's heartbeat, the cracked stitch in the blanket, the way the flute sounded when the wind bent low. By dawn, she knew what she would do. She found Evan near the well. His horse had been tended to, its limp eased by cool water and rest. He turned when she approached, his eyes softening with relief. "Marla," he said. She didn't answer. He took a step forward, then stopped, sensing the distance she'd drawn between them like a knife in the dust. "I came to take you home." She shook her head. He blinked. "You don't belong here." "I didn't belong there either." His mouth opened, but she held up a hand. "I'm not angry," she said. I never chose anything, Evan. Not until I ran." "I was trying to do right by you," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but kindness without freedom is still a cage." She turned then, not quickly, not in fear. She walked back toward the hogan, where the fire was being stoked, and the morning bread was already turning in the skillet. She walked back toward the life she hadn't meant to find, but had begun, slowly, to choose. Evan did not follow. That afternoon he rode away. Hashke watched from the rise above the camp, a carving in his hand. It was the figure of a woman, standing this time, basin held at her side, her eyes lifted toward the open sky. He placed it on the windowsill of Marla's shelter. Sanny said nothing when she saw it, but later she brought Marla a basket of dyed wool, and together they began a new pattern. One of roots, one of storms. One of beginnings not born from flight, but from stillness. Summer deepened. The days burned long and bright, and the nights softened with warm wind and the rustle of cottonwood leaves. Marla stayed, not as a guest, not as a runaway, but as someone becoming. She moved through the camp with quiet purpose now, no longer shrinking beneath glances, no longer counting the days since she'd arrived. Her hands knew their work, shelling beans, dyeing thread, smoothing buckskin with the rounded bones Sanny had gifted her. She had made a shawl, coarse but sturdy, patterned in ochre and deep blue. When she wore it, the elder women nodded with approval. She had begun to dream again, not of distant trains or city lanterns, but of clay-streaked hands and laughter rising with the morning smoke. Hashke showed her how to listen to the ground. "Some truths," he said, crouched beside a trail of rabbit tracks, "only speak if you're willing to be still long enough." They would walk together at dusk, pausing often. He taught her the shapes of stories left in sand, where a snake coiled before the sun, where a fox had passed just before dawn. Marla began to recognize the language of presence, how the land remembered everything without judgment. One evening, under a sky so wide it felt like a held breath, she asked him, "Did you know I would stay?" He considered her question, then said, "I knew the land would give you the choice." Later that night, she found the carving he'd left her, the woman with the basin, her posture no longer bent. Marla traced its shape with reverent fingers, then placed it near her sleeping mat. Word of her presence spread, but no one came again looking. Evan's shadow had passed, and with it, the part of her that had needed to explain herself to anyone. The world outside still turned, but Marla no longer lived at its mercy. She carried a bowl of water each morning to the roots of the crooked juniper, pouring slowly, her offering silent but full. It was her way now. Not with speeches, not with thunder, but in presence, in daily, deliberate acts. Sometimes she sang, just softly when she was alone at the loom or when walking among the drying herbs, a song with no words. Just breath and memory and sunlit sky. In autumn, the young girl with twin braids came to her, cradling a new lamb in her arms. She asked Marla to name it. Marla did, her voice sure. It was not the name of a past she'd fled, nor a future she couldn't yet see. It was a name rooted in the place she had become herself. That night, she stepped outside her shelter, the firelight behind her, the stars flung wide ahead. And for the first time since the morning she'd collapsed in the dust, Marla stood without running in her heart. Not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had chosen to stay. She closed her eyes, and the night held her gently. Not as a stranger, not as a bride, but as one of its own.